Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that might make you grateful for the privacy of modern life. We're exploring medieval intimacy, but not the romanticized version you see in movies with candlelit chambers and passionate embraces. No, tonight we're uncovering the reality of what happened when the most intimate moments of human life became subject to institutional control, so detailed and invasive that it turned the marriage bed into a theological courtroom. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's your wedding night in the year 1400. You're standing outside your bedchamber, but in your hands isn't a bouquet or a love letter. It's an 847-page manual. A theological guide to marital intimacy so complex and detailed that you'll need the next 2 weeks just to understand what you can and cannot do with your own spouse without risking your eternal soul. This isn't fiction. This was reality for medieval couples who discovered that the Catholic Church had transformed the most private act of human experience into a religious procedure more strictly regulated than a papal ceremony. Welcome to medieval intimacy, where every position, every moment, every thought was categorized as either holy or sinful. Where making love to your own spouse could result in excommunication, torture, or death if you did it wrong. Where confessors needed specialized manuals to interrogate couples about their most private moments, and where certain days of the year turned marital affection into serious crime. Tonight, we're going to explore the 5 acts the Church not only permitted, but actively encouraged, and the 5 acts it considered so sinful they could destroy your soul for eternity. Because after this story, you'll understand why medieval sexual repression wasn't just about controlling bodies. It was about creating entire societies through the most elaborate system of intimate terror ever conceived by a religious institution. Let's start with something that will completely change how you think about medieval marriage. The Church didn't forbid all sexual activity. In fact, there were 5 specific acts they not only allowed, but considered marital virtues that guaranteed salvation and divine favor. But here's what will leave you speechless. These permitted acts were so restrictive and mechanical that they turned marital intimacy into something barely recognizable as human connection. The first permitted act was what the Church called pure procreation. This was the only form of intimacy completely approved by religious authorities. The missionary position, performed in total darkness, with the sole purpose of creating children, completed as quickly as possible to minimize time spent on what they termed sinful flesh. The rules were precise and unyielding. The man must penetrate his wife with what the manuals called solemn procreative intent, without preliminary caresses, without passionate kisses, and without any movement that could be interpreted as seeking pleasure. The woman was required to remain completely passive, eyes closed, praying throughout the act to sanctify what the Church saw as a necessary reproductive process. Church records from the Archbishopric of Canterbury contain letters where confessors actually praised couples who had managed to conceive without sin through this method. A letter from 1456 congratulates a noble couple for fulfilling their procreative duty with such purity that neither spouse experienced what the document terms carnal corruption during the conception of their heir. But here's the part that should terrify anyone who values privacy. This act had to be documented. Couples were required to confess the specific details of each intimate encounter to their confessors, who kept detailed records to ensure that procreative purity was maintained. The archives of Toledo Cathedral contain thousands of these intimate records, documenting not just frequency, but exact duration, words spoken, and the level of pleasure experienced. Imagine having to report to your priest whether you enjoyed being with your spouse too much. The second permitted act was something called the sacred marital debt. The church recognized that husbands had the right to demand intimacy from their wives to prevent adultery, but this marital debt had such specific rules that it turned love into a legal transaction. The spouse who owed this debt had to comply with what theologians called holy obedience, while the spouse who demanded it had to do so with divine authority rather than carnal desire. The rules were incredibly complex. A woman who refused the marital debt committed a mortal sin, but a man who demanded it outside permitted days also sinned mortally. There were official calendars marking exactly when this debt could be exercised. Never on Sundays, never during Lent, never during Advent, never on important saints' days, never during menstruation, pregnancy, or breastfeeding. Convent records document a case where a woman was excommunicated for refusing marital duty on a technically permitted day, while her husband received penance for demanding it using words that showed carnal lust rather than holy marital authority. The third permitted act addressed what the church saw as divine infertility. When couples couldn't conceive after a year of marriage, the church allowed specific modifications to the intimate act to correct this spiritual failing. These modifications included slightly altered positions, specific timing based on lunar cycles, and the incorporation of special prayers during the act itself. Medical records from the period show these methods were developed by theologians working with Christian physicians who combined rudimentary medical theory with religious doctrine. The result was intimate procedures so complicated they required prior preparation and confessional supervision. Think about that for a moment. Couples struggling with infertility couldn't simply seek medical help. They had to submit to theological oversight of their most private moments, with priests essentially prescribing specific sexual techniques as spiritual medicine. The fourth permitted act was called the remedy for lust. The church acknowledged that total abstinence could lead to greater sins like adultery or self-pleasure. So they allowed limited marital intimacy as spiritual medicine against these sins. But this medicinal intimacy had to be preceded by confession, followed by penance, and performed with as little satisfaction as possible. Couples who used intimacy as a remedy for lust had to report to their confessors if they had experienced pleasure and received additional penances proportional to the level of satisfaction they reported. Can you imagine? Having to confess to your priest that you enjoyed being with your spouse and then receiving punishment for that enjoyment. It's almost impossible to conceive of a system more designed to destroy natural human affection. The fifth and final permitted act was something called sacramental union in illness. When one spouse was seriously ill and near death, the church allowed a final intimate act considered so sacred it had to be witnessed by a priest to ensure it was performed with purity and holy intent. Parish records contain dozens of cases where couples performed this final intimate act under direct clerical supervision, with specific prayers and with the understanding that it was an earthly farewell before eternal separation. Picture being on your deathbed, wanting one last moment of closeness with the person you love most, and having to do it with a priest watching to make sure you're not enjoying it too much. The level of institutional intrusion into private grief and love is almost beyond comprehension. Now, if these permitted acts seem restrictive to the point of dehumanization, wait until you discover the prohibited acts that could result in torture, death, and eternal damnation. Because the medieval church wasn't content with regulating approved intimacy. They had created such a detailed taxonomy of sexual sin that it included acts most modern people would consider completely normal and harmless. The first and most severely punished prohibited act was having intimacy with your own spouse for the sole purpose of pleasure. this wasn't some obscure theological point. This was the most serious sexual crime in the medieval world. It included any act that lasted longer than necessary for conception, any position that might intensify sensations, any caress that wasn't strictly necessary for reproduction, and any expression of enjoyment during the act. Confessional manuals contained specific questions designed to detect what they called marital lust. Did you last longer than necessary? Did you touch unnecessary parts? Did you experience pleasure during the act? Did you wish to continue after completion? Affirmative answers resulted in penances that could last for years. Records from the Spanish Inquisition document cases where married couples were tortured for confessing that they had been intimate for love rather than procreative duty. In 1487, a couple in Seville was subjected to public torture because the husband confessed that he enjoyed being with his wife more than was appropriate for a devout Christian. The treatise Summa Confessorum specified that intimacy for pleasure was equivalent to adultery in terms of moral gravity, because it turned the marriage bed into what they called a brothel and profaned the sacrament of marriage. Couples guilty of this sin faced temporary excommunication, public penance, and forced separation for periods that could last years. Think about what this meant for ordinary people. Newlyweds who were naturally affectionate, couples who had been married for years and genuinely cared for each other. Anyone who experienced the normal human response of enjoying physical closeness with their spouse, all of them were considered sinners deserving of punishment. The Church had essentially criminalized marital happiness. The second prohibited act was any position other than what we now call missionary. The Church had determined that only one intimate position was morally acceptable. The man on top, the woman on the bottom, face to face with no variations whatsoever. Any other position was considered unnatural and resulted in accusations of bestiality, sodomy, or demonic possession. Court records are filled with cases where couples were arrested for what officials called unnatural acts that turned out to be simply alternative intimate positions. The position where the woman was on top was considered especially sinful because it reversed what theologians called the divine order and allowed the woman to usurp male authority. In 1453, the archives of the Ecclesiastical Court of Paris document the case of a couple sentenced to death for what was termed marital sodomy when they confessed to using positions where the man approached the woman from behind. They were publicly executed as a warning to other couples about the consequences of what the Church called sinful innovation. Theologians had developed elaborate theories about why certain positions were sinful. The side position confused gender roles. The standing position desecrated the marriage bed. Any position that allowed deeper connection demonstrated excessive lust. The level of institutional obsession with controlling the precise mechanics of marital intimacy reveals a system far more concerned with power than with human welfare. The third forbidden act was any oral contact with intimate areas. This was considered one of the most serious sins possible, equivalent to blasphemy and heresy. This included not only explicit oral contact, but also kissing on what they defined as impure areas of the body, meaning anything below the navel. Confessional manuals contained specific warnings about impure kissing and required confessors to ask detailed questions about any oral contact during intimate moments. Penances for oral contact were more severe than penances for some types of murder, because it was considered to corrupt both soul and body in irreversible ways. Inquisition records contain cases where people were tortured to death for confessing acts of what they called marital oral sin. In 1478, a woman in Toledo was burned alive for admitting that she had kissed her husband's private parts during what she described as a moment of conjugal love. The brutality of these punishments reveals the true nature of this system. It wasn't about morality or protecting marriage. It was about establishing total control over human intimacy through terror. The fourth prohibited act was intimacy during forbidden days. The Church had established that approximately 180 days per year were completely forbidden for any intimate activity, even between married spouses. These days included all Sundays, all of Lent, all of Advent, all religious holidays, all fasting days, and additional periods based on the lunar calendar. Couples who were intimate during forbidden days faced penances that could include prolonged fasting, forced pilgrimages, temporary marital separation, and in extreme cases, annulment of marriage. Confessors kept detailed calendars and questioned couples about the exact dates of each intimate encounter. Parish records show that many couples lived in constant fear of accidentally violating the temporal prohibitions. A letter from 1489 describes a woman who wore a special rosary with color-coded beads to remember which days were safe for marital intimacy. Imagine living with your spouse, but being unable to express physical affection for more than half the year. Imagine the anxiety of trying to remember which days were permitted and which could result in punishment. The psychological toll of this system on ordinary marriages must have been devastating. The fifth and final prohibited act was individual or mutual self-pleasure. This was considered one of the most serious sins possible, worse than adultery, because it wasted what theologians called the divine seed without procreative purpose. This included both individual acts and any form of mutual manual stimulation between spouses. Confessors were trained to detect physical signs of self-pleasure and to ask specific questions designed to elicit confessions. Confessional manuals contained graphic descriptions to ensure that penitents understood exactly what was forbidden. Penances were so severe, they often resulted in death by starvation during penitential fasts. Medical records from the period document cases of people who died while serving penances for what the Church called solitary sins, particularly young people who confessed to self-pleasure during adolescence. The fact that the Church was willing to let people die rather than allow them natural physical expression reveals the genocidal nature of this sexual control system. Now we come to the most disturbing aspect of this entire story. The system of surveillance and punishment the Church established to ensure compliance with these intimate regulations. Because it wasn't enough to simply set the rules. They had to be enforced through methods of private spying that would make a modern totalitarian state seem respectful of personal boundaries. Confessors had detailed manuals specifying exactly what questions to ask to extract information about the intimate lives of their parishioners. These questions were so specific and graphic that the manuals came with warnings about how to ask them without corrupting the confessor in the process. The 1486 Confessional Manual contains more than 200 specific questions about intimate activity, including details about frequency, duration, positions, levels of pleasure, thoughts during the act, and physical sensations experienced. Confessors were required to ask these questions of all married adults during mandatory annual confession. But the surveillance system went far beyond confession. Neighbors were encouraged to report any suspicious, intimate activity they might observe or hear. Servants had specific instructions on what to look for in their employers' beds. Innkeepers had to report inappropriate sounds from the rooms of married guests. Court records show cases where couples were arrested, based solely on reports from neighbors about sounds that lasted too long, or bed movements that suggested excessive pleasure. Marital intimacy had effectively been turned into a public act subject to constant community supervision. Privacy, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. Penalties for intimate violations weren't simply additional prayers. They included fasting that could last for months, forced pilgrimages to dangerous destinations, compulsory marital separation, public corporal punishment, and in extreme cases, permanent branding or mutilation. Records from the Diocesan Archive of Burgos document the case of a couple forced to live apart for 3 years for confessing that they had been intimate too often during their first year of marriage. Their children were placed in ecclesiastical custody during this period to protect them from what officials called the influence of lustful parents. But perhaps most devastating was the psychological impact of living under this system of total intimate control. Couples developed terror of their own sexuality, chronic anxiety about every aspect of their private lives, and often complete physical dysfunction caused by constant fear of punishment. Personal diaries from the period reveal marriages destroyed by what can only be called intimate paranoia. One noblewoman wrote in 1467, "My husband and I lie down each night like terrified strangers, counting every movement, timing every moment, wondering if what we feel is holy love or condemnable lust. We have turned our marriage bed into a chamber of the psychological torture, where pleasure is evidence of sin and coldness is evidence of virtue." The effects of this system extended far beyond individual couples. Entire generations grew up with completely distorted concepts of sexuality, intimacy, and love. Systematic, intimate repression created societies where cruelty was normalized, where authoritarian control was accepted as natural, and where basic humanity was considered suspect. Historical studies show direct correlations between the intensity of religious intimate repression and the prevalence of social violence, civil wars, and authoritarian political systems. Societies that most strictly regulated private intimacy also tended to be the most brutal in their public policies. This wasn't coincidence. It was cause and effect. Here, we arrive at the most important insight of this entire exploration. This medieval system of intimate control wasn't simply about regulating physical behavior. It was about establishing total power, the power of an institution to control the most private and personal aspects of human experience. By regulating every aspect of marital intimacy, the Church achieved something no political government had ever attempted: complete control over the private lives of every individual. If one institution could dictate how, when, and why people could be intimate with their own spouses, then there were no limits to its authority. This intimate control was the foundation of all other social controls. A population that had learned to repress its most basic instincts out of fear of divine punishment was a population that could be controlled in any way the religious authority saw fit. Historical records show that societies with greater intimate repression also had greater political obedience, greater acceptance of social inequality, and less resistance to authoritarian policies. Intimate control was the ultimate tool of social control because it reached into the very core of human experience and turned natural affection into a source of fear and guilt. The implications of this system extended through centuries. The sexual shame and dysfunction created by medieval church policies didn't disappear with the end of the Middle Ages. These attitudes became embedded in Western culture, passed down through generations, shaping concepts of intimacy, gender roles, and human sexuality for hundreds of years. Even today, many people struggle with intimate shame and dysfunction that can be traced back to these medieval systems of control. The idea that physical pleasure is somehow sinful, that natural human desires are evidence of moral failing, that intimate relationships should be primarily functional rather than joyful. All of these harmful concepts have their roots in the medieval church's systematic war against human sexuality. Understanding this history is crucial for recognizing how institutional control operates. Authoritarian systems always seek to control the most private aspects of human life because that's where they can establish the deepest psychological dominance. Sexual repression isn't just a side effect of authoritarian control. It's often the foundation upon which that control is built. When we look at the 5 permitted acts and 5 prohibited acts of medieval intimacy, we're not just looking at historical curiosities. We're examining a blueprint for how institutions can use shame, fear, and surveillance to control entire populations through the regulation of their most private moments. The medieval church created a system where love itself became dangerous, where natural human affection was evidence of sin, where the most intimate expressions of human connection were subject to institutional approval or punishment. They turned the marriage bed into a courtroom and made every couple both judge and defendant in their own intimate lives. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. The church understood that if they could control human sexuality, they could control everything else. If they could make people afraid of their own desires, their own bodies, their own capacity for love and pleasure, then they could make them afraid of everything. And fearful people are obedient people. The resistance to this system, when it occurred, was often subtle and hidden. Couples who found ways to express genuine affection despite the restrictions. Confessors who asked the required questions but imposed lighter penances than the manuals demanded. Communities that looked the other way when neighbors expressed too much happiness in their marriages. These small acts of resistance were acts of profound courage, because they risked not just punishment, but eternal damnation according to the religious authorities of their time. Every moment of genuine intimacy, every expression of real love, every refusal to reduce human connection to a mechanical reproductive process was an act of rebellion against a system designed to dehumanize the most human experiences. The stories of individual couples who suffered under this system are heartbreaking. The husband who was tortured for admitting he enjoyed his wife's company. The woman burned alive for kissing her spouse too intimately. The couples forced to live apart for years because they had been too affectionate. The children removed from parents who loved each other too much. But alongside these tragedies, there were also stories of endurance. Couples who found ways to maintain genuine connection despite the restrictions. Families who protected each other from the worst excesses of the surveillance system. Communities that quietly resisted the most invasive aspects of intimate control. These stories remind us that even in the darkest periods of institutional control, human love and connection find ways to survive. The capacity for intimacy, affection, and genuine human bonding is so fundamental to our nature that it persists even under the most systematic attempts to destroy it. The end of the medieval system of intimate control didn't happen overnight. It was gradually eroded by changing social conditions, the Protestant Reformation, the rise of secular authority, and the slow recognition that private life should be beyond institutional control. But the process took centuries, and many of the attitudes created by this system persisted long after the formal controls were removed. Today, we live in a world where intimate freedom is generally protected by law and social custom. We can express affection for our partners without fear of religious punishment. We can enjoy physical pleasure without confessing it to institutional authorities. We can make our own decisions about when, how, and why to be intimate without consulting theological manuals. But this freedom wasn't inevitable. It was won through centuries of struggle against systems of institutional control, and it remains fragile. Around the world today, there are still societies where intimate life is heavily regulated by religious or political authorities. There are still places where expressing affection for the wrong person or in the wrong way can result in punishment or death. Understanding the medieval system of intimate control helps us recognize these modern forms of oppression and resist them. It reminds us that intimate freedom is not a luxury, but a fundamental human right. It shows us how quickly and completely institutional authorities can invade the most private aspects of human life if we allow them to do so. The story of medieval intimate regulation is ultimately a story about power and resistance, about the human capacity for both cruelty and love, about the ways institutions can shape individual lives and the ways individuals can resist institutional control. When we remember the couples who were tortured for loving each other too much, we honor their suffering by protecting the intimate freedoms they were denied. When we recall the children removed from affectionate parents, we commit ourselves to defending the rights of families to express love without institutional interference. And when we consider the elaborate system of surveillance and punishment that turned medieval bedchambers into theaters of fear, we resolve to resist any attempt by modern institutions to invade the private lives of individuals and families. The 5 permitted and 5 prohibited acts of medieval intimacy weren't just religious regulations. They were weapons of social control, tools of psychological domination, methods of creating populations so fearful of their own humanity that they would submit to any authority that promised to manage their shame and guilt. Recognizing this history doesn't mean condemning all religious authority or dismissing the positive aspects of spiritual life. Many religious traditions have offered genuine wisdom about love, relationships, and human sexuality. But it does mean being vigilant about the ways institutional power can be misused to control private life. It means protecting the right of individuals to make their own decisions about intimate relationships without institutional interference. It means resisting attempts by any authority, religious or secular, to shame people for natural human desires, or to regulate private behavior between consenting adults. Most importantly, it means remembering that intimate freedom is not just about individual rights. It's about the kind of society we want to live in. Societies that respect intimate privacy tend to be more humane, more creative, more resistant to authoritarian control. Societies that regulate intimate life tend to be more brutal, more repressive, more accepting of institutional tyranny. The medieval church's regulation of intimate life created a society where love was dangerous, where pleasure was sinful, where natural human affection was evidence of moral failing. The psychological damage of this system lasted for centuries and shaped Western attitudes about sexuality, gender, and relationships in ways we're still trying to overcome. But it also created something else. It created a deep human longing for freedom, for the right to love and be loved without shame, for the recognition that intimate life is too precious and too personal to be subject to institutional control. That longing helped drive the slow liberation of human sexuality from religious and political regulation. It inspired movements for women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and reproductive freedom. It motivated the creation of legal protections for privacy and personal autonomy. Today, when we can express love for our partners without fear of punishment, when we can enjoy physical pleasure without confessing it to authorities, when we can make intimate decisions based on our own values rather than institutional mandates, we're living the dreams of countless medieval couples who were denied these freedoms. The next time someone speaks nostalgically about traditional values or the morality of the past, remember the 847-page manual that regulated medieval intimacy. Remember the couples tortured for loving each other too much. Remember the surveillance system that turned neighbors into spies and confessors into interrogators. Remember that the intimate freedom we enjoy today was won through centuries of struggle against systems designed to control the most private aspects of human life. And remember that protecting these freedoms requires constant vigilance, because history shows us that authoritarian institutions always seek first to control sexuality as a step toward controlling everything else. The story of medieval intimate regulation is ultimately a story about the preciousness of human connection and the importance of protecting it from institutional interference. It's a reminder that love, in all its forms, is too valuable to be regulated by anyone other than the people who share it. And it's a call to vigilance, to ensure that the freedoms won through centuries of struggle are never again surrendered to institutions that would turn human love into a source of fear, shame, and control. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll spare a thought for all those medieval couples who lay awake in terror, wondering if their love was holy enough, if their affection was pure enough, if their humanity was acceptable to the institutions that claimed authority over their most private moments. And perhaps you'll feel a deep gratitude for living in a time when intimate life is recognized as fundamentally private, when love is celebrated rather than regulated, when the bedroom is a sanctuary rather than a courtroom. Because in the end, the greatest victory over systems of intimate control isn't just the protection of individual freedom. It's the recognition that human love, in all its messy, passionate, imperfect reality, is something sacred that belongs to the people who share it, not to the institutions that would claim dominion over it. Sleep well, knowing that your dreams and your love are your own. The transformation of medieval intimate life didn't happen in isolation. It was part of a broader struggle between institutional authority and individual autonomy that played out across every aspect of medieval society. Understanding this context helps us grasp why the Church's control over sexuality was so central to its power structure, and why resistance to this control was so dangerous yet so necessary. The economic dimensions of this intimate control were staggering. The Church didn't just regulate behavior through moral authority. It created an entire economy based on sexual guilt and redemption. Penances often involved substantial financial payments to the Church. Wealthy couples could sometimes buy reduced punishments for intimate sins, while poor couples faced harsh physical penalties for the same acts. Indulgences, those controversial documents that promised reduced punishment for sins, were frequently purchased by couples seeking forgiveness for intimate transgressions. The Vatican's archives contain records of enormous sums paid by nobles seeking absolution for what they termed conjugal excess. A Duke of Burgundy in 1472 paid the equivalent of a knight's annual income for forgiveness after confessing to enjoying his wife's company during Lent. This commercialization of intimate guilt created perverse incentives. Confessors had financial reasons to find sins where none existed. Communities had economic motivations to report suspicious behavior. The Church had institutional incentives to create increasingly complex regulations that guaranteed regular violations and thus regular payments for forgiveness. Parish records from across Europe document this intimate economy of sin and redemption. Churches built elaborate chapels, funded entirely by payments from couples seeking forgiveness for intimate transgressions. Monasteries purchased extensive lands with money collected from marital penances. The regulation of sexuality wasn't just about moral control. It was about economic exploitation on a massive scale. The gender dynamics of medieval intimate control reveal perhaps its most insidious aspects. While both men and women faced severe restrictions, the system was designed to particularly punish female pleasure and autonomy. Women who expressed too much enjoyment during intimate moments faced harsher penances than men who committed the same sin. Women who refused marital duties faced excommunication, while men who demanded duties inappropriately faced only temporary penance. The medieval Church created an elaborate theology that positioned female sexuality as inherently more dangerous and sinful than male sexuality. Drawing on interpretations of Eve's role in the fall, theologians argued that women were naturally more prone to lustful behavior, and thus required stricter control. This wasn't just misogyny, it was systematic gender oppression disguised as religious doctrine. Medical texts from the period, written by church-approved physicians, propagated beliefs about female sexuality that served institutional control rather than human understanding. Women's bodies were described as inherently corrupting, their pleasure as evidence of moral weakness, their desires as dangerous to both themselves and their partners. These beliefs had devastating consequences for individual women. Court records contain heartbreaking accounts of women who internalized the Church's teachings about their own nature. A noblewoman's diary from 1423 reveals a woman so convinced of her own sinfulness that she begged her husband to approach her only for procreation, believing that her natural responses to his touch were evidence of her spiritual corruption. The impact on motherhood was equally severe. Pregnant women faced additional restrictions on their intimate lives based on theological beliefs that pleasure during pregnancy could corrupt the unborn child. New mothers were considered ritually impure for weeks after childbirth, unable to participate in religious ceremonies or receive communion until undergoing purification rituals. These restrictions meant that women's most fundamental experiences of love, sexuality, and motherhood were all subject to male ecclesiastical control. They couldn't enjoy their husband's affection without guilt, couldn't experience pregnancy without additional shame, and couldn't celebrate motherhood without ritual purification from supposed contamination. The psychological effects of this gender-specific oppression created generations of women who were taught to fear and distrust their own bodies and desires. Historical analysis of personal correspondence shows that medieval women often expressed more anxiety about intimate relationships than about warfare, plague, or economic hardship. They had been conditioned to view their own sexuality as their greatest spiritual danger. Yet, resistance took many forms. Women found ways to protect each other from the worst excesses of intimate surveillance. Midwives developed coded languages for discussing women's health issues that avoided ecclesiastical scrutiny. Female religious communities sometimes sheltered women fleeing from marriages where intimate control had become abusive. A fascinating document from a French convent in 1467 reveals nuns who had developed an elaborate system for helping married women understand their own bodies and desires in ways that contradicted official church teaching. These women risked severe punishment to preserve knowledge about female sexuality that the institutional church sought to suppress. The theological justifications for intimate control reveal the sophisticated intellectual framework the medieval church constructed to legitimize its invasion of private life. This wasn't simple prudishness or sexual fear. It was a carefully constructed theological system that positioned sexual control as essential to Christian salvation. Church scholars developed elaborate arguments connecting sexual behavior to cosmic order. They claimed that improper intimate behavior disrupted the divine harmony of creation, that sexual pleasure beyond reproductive necessity demonstrated rebellion against God's plan, that even married couples who enjoyed each other too much were participating in the same spiritual corruption that had caused the fall of man. These weren't casual opinions. They were formal theological doctrines taught in universities, preached from pulpits, and encoded in canon law. The intellectual sophistication of these justifications made them particularly powerful because they convinced many people that intimate control wasn't about institutional power, but about spiritual truth. The influence of Augustine's writings on sexuality provided much of the foundation for medieval intimate control. Augustine's personal struggles with sexual desire, combined with his theological genius, created a body of work that positioned sexual pleasure as inherently corrupting. His influence on medieval theology cannot be overstated. When Augustine wrote about the spiritual dangers of carnal pleasure, he was shaping centuries of Christian thought about human sexuality. But Augustine's teachings were selectively interpreted and often distorted by medieval theologians who used his authority to justify levels of control that went far beyond anything he had envisioned. Augustine had written about the spiritual challenges of sexual desire. Medieval church authorities transformed his nuanced theological reflections into detailed legal codes for regulating intimate behavior. Thomas Aquinas further developed these theological justifications, creating what became known as natural law theology. Aquinas argued that sexual acts were only moral when they aligned with what he saw as the natural purpose of sexuality, reproduction within marriage. Any sexual act that deviated from this narrow purpose was considered contrary to natural law and thus sinful. Aquinas' intellectual framework provided theological legitimacy for the detailed regulation of intimate behavior. His arguments were so sophisticated and his reasoning so systematic that they convinced many medieval intellectuals that intimate control was not just religiously required, but philosophically necessary. The global scope of medieval intimate control extended far beyond Western Europe. As Christianity spread through missionary activity and political conquest, these systems of sexual regulation were imposed on cultures around the world that had previously maintained very different approaches to human sexuality. In Ireland, the arrival of Roman Christianity disrupted Celtic traditions that had been far more accepting of sexual pleasure and diverse intimate arrangements. Irish monks' records show the systematic suppression of indigenous sexual customs and the imposition of continental European standards of intimate control. The conquest of Islamic Spain brought Christian intimate regulations into contact with very different Islamic approaches to sexuality. The resulting cultural conflicts created unique forms of sexual oppression as competing religious authorities sought to control the intimate lives of mixed populations. In Eastern Europe, the Orthodox Church developed its own variations of intimate control that were often even more restrictive than Western Catholic practices. Byzantine theological texts describe systems of sexual regulation so detailed that they made Western confessional manuals seem permissive by comparison. The Crusades spread these systems of intimate control throughout the Mediterranean world. Crusader states imposed Western Christian sexual regulations on diverse populations, creating cultural upheavals that lasted for centuries. The psychological trauma of having intimate customs suddenly criminalized contributed to the broader devastation of the crusading period. Missionary activity in Northern Europe brought Christian intimate control to Germanic and Scandinavian cultures that had maintained very different traditions around sexuality and marriage. The conversion of these populations involved not just changes in religious belief, but fundamental transformations in how people understood their own bodies and desires. The resistance movements that emerged in response to medieval intimate control took many forms, from individual acts of defiance to organized theological challenges to the Church's authority over private life. Understanding this resistance helps us appreciate that the oppressive system we've been exploring wasn't accepted passively by its victims. Individual resistance often took the form of what historians call everyday defiance. Couples found ways to maintain genuine intimacy despite the restrictions. They developed private languages for discussing their relationship that avoided ecclesiastical terminology. They created personal rituals of affection that circumvented official regulations. Some couples simply lied to their confessors about their intimate lives, a form of resistance that required tremendous courage given the spiritual consequences they believed would follow. Church records contain references to couples who were caught in such deceptions and faced severe punishments, but these documented cases likely represent only a small fraction of the actual resistance. More organized resistance came from within the church itself. Some confessors quietly refused to enforce the most intrusive aspects of intimate surveillance. They asked the required questions but imposed lighter penances than the manuals demanded. They found theological justifications for allowing couples more freedom than official doctrine permitted. A remarkable document from 1445 reveals a group of confessors in southern France who had developed an alternative approach to intimate counseling that emphasized love and mutual care rather than rigid rule following. These priests risked their own positions to protect the intimate lives of their parishioners from the more oppressive aspects of ecclesiastical control. Intellectual resistance emerged from unexpected quarters. Some theologians began questioning whether the Church's detailed regulation of intimate life was actually supported by Scripture or early Christian tradition. These scholars argued that the elaborate systems of sexual control represented later innovations rather than authentic Christian teaching. The Franciscan movement, with its emphasis on poverty and simplicity, inadvertently challenged the Church's commercialization of intimate guilt. When Franciscan friars preached that spiritual purity came through renunciation of worldly wealth rather than payment of monetary penances, they undermined one of the economic foundations of intimate control. Popular religious movements sometimes developed alternative approaches to sexuality and marriage that challenged official church doctrine. The Beguines, lay religious women who lived in communities without taking formal vows, created spaces where women could explore spirituality and community in ways that weren't available within the official church structure. These alternative communities often developed more humane approaches to questions of sexuality and relationships. While they weren't explicitly challenging church teaching on intimate matters, their very existence provided models for how religious life could function without the detailed, intimate surveillance that characterized mainstream Catholicism. The long-term consequences of medieval intimate control shaped Western civilization in ways that are still visible today. The psychological patterns established during this period influenced attitudes toward sexuality, gender, and authority that persisted long after the formal controls were removed. The Protestant Reformation can be understood partly as a reaction against the Catholic Church's control over private life, including intimate relationships. When Martin Luther argued for the priesthood of all believers, he was challenging not just theological doctrine, but the entire system of ecclesiastical authority over personal matters. Luther's own marriage to a former nun was a direct challenge to Catholic intimate regulations. By openly celebrating marital affection and rejecting celibacy requirements for clergy, early Protestant reformers were making powerful statements about the proper relationship between religious authority and private life. However, Protestantism didn't immediately solve the problems of intimate control. Many Protestant communities developed their own forms of sexual regulation that were sometimes even more restrictive than Catholic practices. Puritan communities in particular created systems of intimate surveillance that rivaled medieval Catholic methods in their intrusiveness. The scientific revolution was influenced by medieval patterns of intimate control in unexpected ways. The same intellectual approaches that theologians had used to categorize and regulate sexual behavior were applied to the study of natural phenomena. The medieval obsession with classification and control helped shape early scientific methodology. Conversely, scientific discoveries about human anatomy and reproduction gradually undermined theological justifications for intimate control. When physicians began understanding the actual biological functions of sexual organs and processes, many religious claims about the spiritual dangers of pleasure began to seem less credible. The Enlightenment's emphasis on individual reason and autonomy was partly a reaction against medieval systems of institutional control over private life. Enlightenment philosophers like John Stuart Mill explicitly argued that individual liberty included the right to make personal decisions about intimate relationships without external interference. The French Revolution's assault on ecclesiastical authority included specific attacks on the Church's role in regulating marriage and sexuality. Revolutionary governments attempted to create secular alternatives to religious marriage that would free intimate relationships from clerical control. The Romantic movement in literature and art was partly a celebration of the emotional and sexual freedom that had been suppressed by medieval intimate control. Romantic poets and novelists explicitly celebrated passionate love and sexual desire as positive human experiences rather than spiritual dangers. The development of modern psychology was influenced by centuries of intimate repression created by medieval control systems. Early psychologists like Freud were attempting to understand and treat psychological disorders that had their roots in religious sexual shame and fear. Contemporary feminist movements can trace many of their concerns back to the gender-specific oppression embedded in medieval, intimate control systems. The fight for women's sexual autonomy and reproductive rights is, in many ways, a continuation of the resistance that began during the medieval period. Modern discussions about the relationship between religious authority and personal freedom often echo debates that began during the medieval period. Questions about whether religious institutions should have any role in regulating private, intimate behavior remain contentious in many societies. The legacy of medieval intimate control appears in unexpected places throughout modern culture. Wedding traditions that emphasize female purity, legal systems that treat intimate violence as less serious than other forms of assault, and cultural patterns that shame sexual pleasure all have roots in medieval systems of religious control. Understanding this history helps explain why intimate freedom remains fragile, even in supposedly progressive societies. The patterns of shame, fear, and control established during the medieval period created psychological and cultural templates that influence behavior long after the formal systems that created them have disappeared. Educational systems that avoid honest discussion of sexuality, medical practices that shame patients for intimate concerns, and social customs that treat passionate love as somehow embarrassing or inappropriate all reflect the continuing influence of medieval intimate control systems. Perhaps, most importantly, recognizing this history helps us understand that intimate freedom isn't natural or inevitable. It was won through centuries of struggle against powerful institutions that had every incentive to maintain control over private life. Protecting these freedoms requires vigilance and active resistance to attempts to reimpose institutional control over intimate relationships. The medieval regulation of sexuality represents one of history's most systematic attempts to control the private lives of entire populations. Its effects shaped Western civilization for centuries and continue to influence contemporary culture in subtle but significant ways. As we conclude this exploration of medieval intimate control, we're left with profound questions about the relationship between institutional authority and individual autonomy. The couples who suffered under these systems were real people with real desires for love, connection, and happiness. Their suffering matters not just as historical tragedy, but as a warning about what happens when institutions are allowed unlimited authority over private life. Their resistance, both individual and collective, reminds us that human dignity and freedom are precious and fragile. The intimate freedoms we enjoy today weren't inevitable. They were won through the courage of people who refused to accept that their most private moments should be subject to institutional control. Every time we express love without shame, enjoy physical pleasure without guilt, or make intimate decisions based on our own values rather than external authority, we honor the memory of those who were denied these basic human rights. And every time we resist attempts to reimpose institutional control over private life, we continue their struggle for human dignity and freedom. The story of medieval intimate regulation is ultimately a story about power and resistance, about the human capacity for both oppression and liberation, about the eternal struggle between those who would control and those who would be free. It reminds us that intimate freedom is not a luxury, but a fundamental human right, and that protecting this freedom requires constant vigilance against those who would use shame, fear, and authority to control the most private aspects of human life. Sleep well, knowing that your dreams and your love are your own.